Hi and welcome. What we're going to do in the next few minutes is to have a look at this very short melody, which could be a 3-bar phrase, which is an irregular phrase, of course, so a bit unusual, but it does sometimes happen. Or it could just be the approach to a particular cadence. And how are we going to harmonize this? So we end up with 4-part harmony, and I'm sort of thinking that we'd do it as for voices, S-A-T-B, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, but of course you could do it in a different format for piano or for instruments or something, but really just to think about the harmony of how we might go about this task. And in particular, how we might do this in a minor key, because lots of people have been in touch with us to say, we're sort of reasonably happy doing this in major keys. As soon as we do it in a minor key, we suddenly find life is a bit more tricky. Now, first of all, how do we know that we're in a minor key? Well, we've got 3 sharps, so the circle of fifths will tell us that we're either in A major or in F sharp minor. Now, I've just mentioned the circle of fifths. If you've never heard of the circle of fifths, you might want to pause at this moment and find our Music Matters video on the channel that is telling you all about the circle of fifths, because the circle of fifths is the big kind of clue to how all the keys work. It tells you all the keys, all the major and minor keys, all the key signatures. And the circle of fifths, when you look at it, will show you that when you have 3 sharps, you're either in A major or you're in F sharp minor. Well, the big clue here as to why we're in F sharp minor is E sharp. If you were in A major, you wouldn't expect to see any accidentals other than those in the key signature. So that's always a bit of a clue. If you're looking at a key signature saying, how do I know if this is in the major key or the relative minor key? Just think, how many accidentals can I see in what I've been given? If you see none at all, there's a very good chance that you are actually in the major key. There's just an outside chance that maybe one of the notes that would be affected if you're in a minor key just happens not to be there. So you've got to just keep your radar up to just check that one out. But other clues, well, it finishes on F sharp, and if this is the end of something, double bar line, well, if it was in A major, you might expect it to finish on A or one of the notes of a tonic chord of A major. That's always worth bearing in mind. So if it were to finish in A major, it might finish on A, but it might finish on C sharp, it might finish on E, because those are other notes of the tonic chord of A major. But you'll notice that F sharp doesn't belong to the tonic chord of A major. So much stronger chance that we're in F sharp minor. But this E sharp is the big clue. Why is that? Well, why is it E sharp? Because if you're in a minor key, remember that in the harmonic minor scale, you're going to raise the 7th degree of the scale. Okay, so if I'm in F sharp minor, the 7th degree of the scale is E. I've got 3 sharps, haven't I? F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp. So that's F sharp natural minor, just using the key signature. When I do the harmonic minor, I'm going to raise the 7th degree. So that's E. If I raise it a semitone, it becomes E sharp. E sharp. That's an interesting clue. So harmonic minor, we raise the 7th degree going up and coming down the scale. And in F sharp minor, it's going to give us E sharp. In the melodic minor, we raise the 6th and the 7th degrees going up, so that's going to give us D sharp and E sharp. Coming down the scale, it's going to give us E natural and D natural. So some people get confused with all this stuff because they look through and they think, oh my goodness, there's an E sharp there, but there's an E natural there. How do I know where I am? Well, if there's a mixture of E sharps and E naturals, then that's something we might well expect to find, even though we're still in the key of F sharp minor, because when you do the melodic minor ascending, you'll have E sharp. When you use the melodic minor descending, you'll have E natural. In reality, in pieces of music, there's a constant mix of harmonic and melodic minor. If you think of it this way, harmonic minor, the word is a clue, it's about harmony, it's about chords. Melodic minor is about melody. But sometimes there's a conflict of interest between the harmony and the melody, so there's no point in having E sharp in one part and E natural in another part, it's just going to clash. So you have to have a sort of meeting of the minds there. Sometimes you'll find You've got the descending melodic minor scale in an ascending passage and vice versa. That doesn't matter. It sometimes happens in reality within a piece of music. But the big clue is the E sharp. It's a raised seventh in F sharp minor. So we should have no doubt at all that we're in the key of F sharp minor. Now, if you're trying to harmonize a passage, it's always a good idea to begin with a cadence once you know which key you're in. So where's the cadence? It's going to be here, the last two chords of the phrase. So just remind yourself about cadences. What are the options? It could be a perfect cadence, which goes chord 5 followed by chord 1. It could be a plagal cadence, which is chord 4 followed by chord 1. It could be an imperfect cadence, which technically is anything followed by 5, but in reality is 1 to 5, 4 to 5, or 2 to 5. Or it could be an interrupted cadence, which is going to go 5 to 6. Well, if this is the last chord of this piece of music, short though it is, we might expect it to finish on a chord 1. It's a bit unusual if it doesn't. There are occasionally pieces of music that finish on a chord 5 or something, but most of them will finish on chord 1. So maybe the first question to ask yourself is, does chord 1 fit that chord? Now, if you can just sort of imagine all these chords in your mind, that's great. If you're struggling, then of course the answer is to write the chords out. You could just write the letters out if you wanted to, or you could put them on a stave and then you can absolutely see what's going on. So if you're struggling a little bit in F sharp minor, well, let's just get the chords on the board. So there's my key signature. Here's a scale of F sharp minor. And because we're dealing with chords, I'm thinking harmonic minor. All right, so always start by thinking harmonic minor when you're dealing with chords. You may have to make some adjustments, but that's your starting point. I've only gone to the 7th degree of the scale. There's no point in putting F sharp at the top because we've got F sharp down here. And when I want to find my chords, remember, I'm going to put a 3rd and a 5th above each of these notes. And remember, because I've got E sharp here, I'm also going to have E sharp anywhere else it might appear. That's an important thing to think about, especially in relation to this chord, chord 5. It's amazing, in a minor key, how many people write chord 5 and they forget that the middle note is the leading note of the scale, therefore is usually going to be raised. So lots of people will use a chord 5 and have E natural in it, when it should have E sharp in it. So that's why it's important to remember that, especially in relation to chord 5. Very common mistake when you're thinking about harmonization in minor keys. So let's just have our chord numbers here. There they are. Okay, now before we get into this question of the cadence, we might just think a little bit about what's going on. Funny thing in a minor key, that there are only 2 minor chords. And lots of people start with a misconception that if you're in a major key, well, all the chords must be major. If you're in a minor key, all the chords must be minor. It doesn't work like that. In a minor key, chord 1 is minor. Chord 4 is minor. All the other chords are actually something else. Funny that, isn't it? Chord 5 is major. Chord 6 is major. Chord 3 is augmented. And that's a very good reason why when you're in a minor key, chord 3 is generally speaking worth avoiding. It's a slightly dramatic chord, that one. So if I get chord 1, chord 2, chord 3, it's got that sort of horror movie quality to it. So if you want to stab someone in the shower while you're doing your film score, well, chord 3 is a great choice. But generally speaking, when you're harmonizing chord 3 in a minor key, worth avoiding. That leaves us with 2 other chords, chord 2 and chord 7, and they are diminished chords. So you find lots of textbooks say, oh, don't use chord 7 because it's diminished. And when you're in a minor key, don't use chord 7, don't use chord 2 because they're diminished, and they're awkward customers because they sound a bit ugly when they're in root position. You know, if I do this, it doesn't sound great, does it really? So that's a diminished chord. However, chord 2 is actually quite an important chord in our sort of vocabulary of chords. What I would say to you is this: if you're going to use a diminished chord, in other words, chord 7 in a major key, or chord 2 or chord 7 in a minor key, diminished chords, use them in first inversion. They sound so much better in first inversion. If I put 2 there, it sounds better than if it's there, doesn't it? It sounds a bit ugly in root position. First inversion sounds quite nice. So if you want to use a diminished chord, particularly chord 2 that you might want to use in a minor key, try to use it in first inversion. So that's just covered a little bit of ground about using chords in minor keys. So back to our cadence, and we're hoping that chord 1 might fit the final cadence. Well, does it? F sharp, A, C sharp, that's F sharp, so we're in business, aren't we? We can have a chord 1 for our final cadence. Maybe I'll write these chords in the middle of the stave, because otherwise we're going to get muddled up with all this down here. So there's chord 1. If that is chord 1, you'll notice I've done the last chord first. That's helpful, because if this is a cadence, then we finish on 1. Either it's a perfect cadence that goes 5-1, or it's a play chord cadence that goes 4-1. So your next question is, does E sharp fit chord 5, or does it fit chord 4? Well, when we look at 4, B, D, F sharp, well, there's no E sharp in there, so it can't be that. Chord 5, C sharp, E sharp, G sharp, aha, there is an E sharp. So this must be a perfect cadence. Now, it could be an interrupted cadence, because you notice in chord 6, there is an F sharp. So we could have gone 5-6, called it an interrupted cadence. But we're assuming for the purposes of this exercise that this is the end. So we don't particularly want to end on an interrupted cadence. So probably 5-1 perfect cadence is your best option. Once you've worked out a cadence, sometimes it's quite a good idea to think about what we call the approach chord. In other words, what's the chord that comes immediately before the cadence? And sometimes there are sort of little formula that gets used, don't they? So you might go 2-5-1, 2B 5-1, 2-7B 5-1, 2-7B 5-7-1. These are all kind of formula that get used a lot. 1C 5-1, that's another one. And the good thing about 1C is we have to be a bit careful that we don't use second inversions too much. But if we get a chance to put one in that's going to work, well, that's an opportunity worth taking. So does chord 1C fit here, for example? Or does chord 4 fit there? Because 4-5-1 could be another one. Well, let's investigate by deciding which chords have an F sharp in them. Well, we can see that chord 1 has got an F sharp in it. What else has an F sharp? Chord 4 has an F sharp in it. And our other chord with F sharp is 6. Well, we could go 1-5-1, but in a way that's a little bit tedious, because we've had 1, we go to 5, we come back to 1. So that in itself is perhaps not the best option. 4-5-1 would give us a perfectly decent progression. 6-5-1 might be all right, but I'll tell you why maybe it's not quite so good. If I go 6-5, I'm going to have D and then C sharp in the bass. So the bass is going to go down a step in parallel with the soprano. It doesn't create a problem with consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves, but it might well do when we start to write the other parts. So if it's possible to get a bit of contramotion between the top and the bottom, that's always a good move. So we could go 4-5-1, probably not going to go for 6-5-1, or we could think about our 1-5-1, because we could do 1C-5-1. So I hope you can see why 6 would work, but might be problematic. 4 is a perfectly reasonable possibility, but 1C might be rather nice, because we're not going to get much opportunity to put in a second inversion chord. If 1C is followed by 5, the reason why that works so well is that the bottom note of 1C will also be the bottom note of 5. So it has a nice progression with the same bass note. So I'm going to opt for the 1C-5-1 thing there. Okay, great. We've only got 2 chords left to find. Let's see what else we're going to do. If this is the first chord, well, again, if chord 1 fits, probably sensible, isn't it? And it does. So let's put a chord 1 there. Now you could be concerned, you could be thinking, well, we've got one there, we've got one there, we've got one there. So 3 of our chords are ones. But the fact that this is a 1C shouldn't disturb you too much. The fact we're starting on a 1 and finishing on a 1 kind of makes sense. We want to do something else on the next chord. Now this G sharp is quite an interesting one. Let's work out our options. G sharp appears in chord 2. G sharp also appears in chord 5, and G sharp also appears in chord 7. So 7 is usually the chord that we think, do I really want to use chord 7? Probably not your first choice. It does get used, again, in first inversion because it's diminished, but I don't think it's going to work amazingly well here. So let's shoot chord 7. I could use chord 5, but then what's going to happen? We're going to go 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, which is not the most exciting option, is it? So maybe I should be looking at this chord 2. So let's opt for chord 2, remembering what I said a few moments ago. Chord 2 is a diminished chord, so therefore it's ugly in root position, sounds good in first inversion. So let's go for a chord 2B. So we've now got a sort of more varied arrangement of chords within the handful of notes that we're looking at. So that's why I'm going for 2 rather than for another 5. We've also got something in first inversion, something in second inversion, and the rest are in root position. So it's a nice little sort of balance. Tempting to write everything in root position, gets a bit tedious after a while, but you don't want to have too many things going in other inversions, but a bit of a balance between root position and first inversion with the odd possibility of a second inversion thrown in. We've managed to achieve that here. Now, once you've got your chords sorted, next job is put the bass line in. So what's the root of chord 1? It's F sharp. What's going to be at the base of 2B? It's going to be B. I could have taken the bass up to B, but actually it's going to leave everything too close together. So better to space it out. We've got room for the middle parts then. The base of chord 1C is going to be C sharp. And that works well because having done this leap down, we've now got stepwise movement. And can you see this is going up and down, this is going down and up. So we're getting a bit of contribution there. We said that 1C to 5 throws up the same note in the bass, so there it is. And then we're going to finish on an F sharp. Well, it could be this F sharp, could be bottom F sharp. Well, it doesn't really matter, but why not put it down there? We started up here, we'll finish down there. So we've now got the bass line in place. And you see the contribution that's sort of going on between the top and the bottom? That's going to help us not write a whole pile of consecutive fifths and octaves and things. Now, next job, fill in the chord. So this is chord 1. What's in chord 1? F sharp, A, C sharp. We've got 2 F sharp, so it's logical that one of these parts is going to have A, one's going to have C sharp. Now, if we put A in the tenor, C sharp in the alto, that will be the best arrangement. If I'd put the C sharp in the tenor part, well, where's the A going to go in the alto? You can't write above the soprano, so it'd end up coming down here, and then the middle parts have crossed over, so that's not terribly logical. Chord 2, G sharp, B, D. I've got a B, I've got a G sharp. So the thing I need to make sure I have got is a D. Well, the D sort of steps on from the first note in the alto, so that makes sense to stick it there. I could double the B, because then the tenor part also moves by step, so that makes sense. 1C. I've got C sharp in the bass, I've got F sharp at the top, so I'm going to need an A somewhere, so that's our top priority. Where does A go? It sort of seems to flow into the tenor part there, doesn't it? A C sharp would flow nicely in the alto, so you're not just thinking about, oh, I've got some notes to stick in, what shall I stick where? You're also thinking, how does it progress from the previous chord? How does it go on to the next chord in due course? Do I want to end up putting C sharp here? Not really, because A would then be below the tenor part. Gets a bit tangled. Chord 5 coming up. C sharp, E sharp, G sharp. Well, I've got C sharp and E sharp. I need G sharp, so let's put that one in. Tenor's the obvious place to put it, isn't it? And then I could put my C sharp as a double note in the alto because that repeats that one rather nicely. And then on to chord 1 to finish, F sharp, A, C sharp. I've got 2 F sharps, so really I could do with the A and the C sharp. You don't have to have the 5th of a chord, but on the other hand, if you can put it in, it makes the chord stronger. So I do need an A and a C sharp. Well, you can see the most obvious solution. The tenor wants to come back to A, and the alto wants to repeat the C sharp. So how about that? By the time we're finished, we've got a piece of 4-part harmony that sounds like this. Which works pretty well, doesn't it? Now, when you've done it, check it through, make sure you haven't got any consecutives between any parts. Hopefully I haven't here. And then, you might want to include a little bit of decoration. I mean, for example, the tenor here could have a little quaver going up to a B, because that would then make that 5 into 5/7. Just gives you a bit of quaver movement. When you have a chord 5, if you can tuck in a note that makes it 5/7, that just enriches it a bit. Just be careful when you resolve 5/7, 7th wants to fall by a step, 3rd wants to rise by a step. So as long as it can do that, which it does in this case, life is good. How does it sound now? So just a little added spice in the tenor there. So I hope that's useful in just thinking about harmonizing a melody in a minor key.